Congratulations, Sam Pollard. Unbelievable.
Thank you very much.
I mean, this is really a monumental work that goes beyond the question of surveillance. And, you know, it was very needed to stimulate conversation and to continue trying to put into place the meaning of this period of time and of King himself and of where we are today as much as anything. And so, you know, this could be a long conversation. But let's just start with the idea. What brought you to the project? And as you got into it, where did it lead you, even unexpectedly, in your own thinking about the time and the place and the moment?
Around 2017, the producer of the film, Benjamin Medine, gave me a call. We had worked together on another documentary that was about 4 years in the making, titled Two Trains Running, about the search for these two iconic musicians, blues musicians, Son House and Skip James in Mississippi. And it was around 1964 that this group of white guys went down searching for those two men doing Freedom Summer. So we finished that film, and Ben was thinking he was looking for another project for us to do. And he had read David Garrett's book about the FBI and King. And he said, Sam, I think this should be our next film. And I happen to have known David Garrett because he was one of our advisors on Eisner Prize too, when I was a producer. So we reached out to David. We flew to Pittsburgh, we got a crew in Pittsburgh, and we spent 4 hours with him talking about, you know, the research he found, the material he dug into, and learning about the FBI's surveillance of King and what they were trying to do to Dr. King. We took an option on the book, and like all independent filmmakers, we started scouring around trying to raise the money. And we took it to Netflix, we took it to Amazon, we put together a sizzle reel. And everybody always said the same thing. Well, this is a really big subject, but we don't feel like we can see it as a way to bankroll it. So a year and a half went by, and finally, the two companies that's in the opening credits, Field of Vision, that was started by Laura Poitras, and another company called Play Action that was started by Jeffrey Lurie, who owns the Philadelphia Eagles, who's gotten into documentary films. They both came on board. They helped enable us to make the film. And in the fall of 2019, we shot all the interviews. We shot all the interviews. The one exception in terms of not being on camera was James Coney, who initially had said yes to doing it on camera, but then he couldn't do it. So we just did audio with him. So we shot Clarence Jones and Andy Young and Donna Murch and Beverly Gage and Mark Peresquia. You know, it was a small group. And one of the things I had said to Ben, as we were thinking about creatively how to put the film together, I had seen a film in 2012 called The Black Power Mixtape that was done by a Swedish filmmaker, and the thing that was extraordinary about that film was that there was nobody on camera. It was all archival footage and all voices: Cornel West, Harry Belafonte, Angela Davis. So I said, you know, like all filmmakers, I'm going to steal this idea for this film. And so that was one of the first caveats I had in terms of how to make the film. And so we brought in, after we finished shooting, we brought in this editor, a young editor named Laura Tomaselli. We brought in Brian Becker, the archival researcher, and we did that. We wanted to really dig into the archive, both in terms of King's work from the 50s through the 60s, up to his assassination, the FBI. And the other thing I had said as we were going into post-production was, I'm a real big film buff, and I had seen all these old B movies. So I said, we need to make sure we go back and find all those movies where J. Edgar Hoover approved the FBI. So we found I Was a Communist for the FBI, Fred Lovejoy. We found the FBI story with Jimmy Stewart, Big Jim McClain, John Wayne. Anything that was about the FBI show that was on television with Efren Zimbalist Jr. So I wanted to make sure we got all those elements in the film too. And we shot the recreation stuff. You see the reel-to-reel tapes and the actors looking at documents and the files. We shot that in March 2020, 2 days before New York City closed down. On a set in Brooklyn. We built a set, we built the props and everything. And as soon as I finished that shoot with this wonderful DP, Robert Chappell, de Blasio closed the city down. So all the post-production was done remotely. We had myself in New York, Ben Nadine, the producer in Atlanta, Laura Tomaselli in upstate New York. And that's how we worked on the film for the next five to 6 months, you know, in the editing process.
Well, it's got a propulsive energy and pacing that unfolds as suspenseful in many ways as, you know, a thriller. And it sort of in some ways is, because there's this undercurrent of tension that is building throughout, and you can even see the change in the strategy of the FBI away from trying to sort of do the anti-communist thing to the salacious sex life allegations. And of course, you know, and I'm sure you do know, but you know, the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, I mean, Hoover started in like 1917, before the FBI was even created, as this sort of little bit odd duck character in Washington, D.C., living with his mother and going to work and really being gung-ho. And as in 1919, the FBI precursor put out a major policy paper talking about how, you know, the so-called Negro was the force to be reckoned with, the threat to communist insurrection in the United States.
Exactly.
This was not a creation of the 1950s, even though it was accelerated then. And so, you know, and I think it's also significant to note that the Republican and Democratic parties in this stage of American history were sort of competing for the Ku Klux Klan vote. The established political parties were not offering any kind of real recognition or empowerment to people of color in this country.
Exactly.
And that when you look, but nonetheless, there was political reckoning taking place through things like labor unions. And who was in the wings of those labor union struggles supporting black workers were early socialists and communists, and that's just the reality of it. And if civil rights was a serious concern of yours, it wouldn't be unusual that you would be in some kind of alliance during that period.
That's exactly right.
Labor unions, socialists, populist farmers of the upper Midwest who were white, who were making inroads to make alliances with black sharecroppers in the South. It was a dynamic political time, but the established political parties were not really a part of it. And so, you know, A. Philip Randolph, Marcus Garvey, there were other black leaders during the early part of the 20th century who were subjected to harassment and surveillance.
And they were seeing threats. I mean, absolutely.
And so essentially what the FBI is doing is following a policy that has more or less been in place for 70 years. And they saw in King the delivery of a powerful movement leader that was actually going to deliver. And he became the enemy. And they treated him as that. What is it that you think about King? I mean,
I think the reason that they were so frightened of King is because he was a quiet storm. He came along and he preached nonviolence, but he preached he wanted change. And he was galvanizing, you know, African Americans around the country, particularly in the South. And that had to absolutely frighten J. Edgar Hoover. You know, that this man was making inroads. I mean, from the Montgomery bus boycott onward, he was making major inroads like no other black leader had done.
yeah.
So that had to be extremely frightening to J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. You know, so that's why they made it their business to try to figure out how to destroy his reputation. You know, and what you're saying is right. I mean, it goes back to Garvey and A.J. Randolph, you know, and the fact that the notion of socialism and communism was frightening to America, you know, frightening to America. I mean, Richard Wright's book, Native Son, speaks to that. Which is very, very eloquent. So, you know, that's why he was, I mean, what's interesting to me about working on this film is two things. In 1987, I was on Eyes on the Prize too, and I said this to audiences before, and my sort of picture of King was that he walked on water, you know, and I didn't think he could do anything wrong. But as I've gotten older, and there's been other books and stories and articles about him, you see that he's a more complicated man. On the other side of the spectrum, for me, growing up in America in the 60s, I used to think the FBI was the Cats Pajamas. I used to think they were fantastic, you know?
Yeah.
And then it just, you know, again, the realization, the peeling away of the onion, you see, uh-oh, they're not what I thought they were, you know? And it goes to that whole notion that they say, what's the name, Beverly Gage says at the end of the film, that there's a complexity to human beings, a complexity to life. And one of the challenges for me always as a documentary filmmaker is to dig into that complexity, you know,
sure.
And dig into these issues that are constant in American society.
Yeah, right. Sure. And I know some people actually in the white anti-war movement, because I recommended this film last spring, and they came back to me and they said, why did you recommend that film when it puts Dr. King in this light as the adulterer?
Yeah.
Well, what do you have to say?
I say this. I say, sure, he was an adulterer, but as Clarence Jones says in the epilogue, it doesn't take away from all the good that Dr. King did. He was just human. He was as human as anyone else, you know. And he had his, if you want to say their flaws, he had his flaws.
Sure.
But that wasn't, to me, that wasn't the main objective. And it was a real challenge for us as filmmakers, for Ben and myself, when it got to the rape allegation section, how to deal with that. Because we knew that we couldn't leave it out, you know. We had to confront it, we had to deal with it. That's why the way I feel that Donna Mersh and Beverly Gage and Garrett talk about it, it kind of leaves it a little gray, you know.
Right.
Because when she says, one of them says, they say he laughed, you know, and the minister supposedly raped this woman. Well, the FBI didn't have any cameras in that room. So how do they know what really happened in there? You know, some of it could be true, some of it's not true. So to me, you got to be able to challenge it. I mean, I've had some people say to me, you've done a disservice to Dr. King. Well, I don't think so.
No.
You know, I don't think I did a disservice to Dr. King.
No, it allows you to, you know, examine him, yes, in the broader spectrum as a living human being, because there is something almost deified about King, which rightly so. But let's bring him down to human scale. And let's also remember that JFK,
Right.
hello?
Mike went off.
Mike went off. Hello? Hello?
Where's the
Hello?
tech guy?
Yeah. Okay, well, let's also remember that...
Is there a red light on the mic?
Yeah.
Okay, battery's dead.
Battery's gone, okay. I mean, let's also remember that JFK, Lyndon Johnson, and frankly, J. Edgar Hoover. You know, J. Edgar Hoover.
That was never on.
That's on.
This is, it says it's on.
Is it a replacement there?
Hello?
Okay.
Hello? Hello? Mine's not.
We'll replace it for today.
Hello. Anyway, let's remember that J. Edgar Hoover, who persecuted homosexuals, gay people, was a closeted gay man whose number 2 guy in power was his lover.
Oh, yeah.
You know, so the hypocrisy, I mean, Clyde Tolson, who was the number 2 guy in the FBI for decades,
Years.
was J. Edgar Hoover's lover.
Yeah.
And this guy persecuted gay people and, you know, held this sanctimonious position around sexuality. So, you know, we don't need, I mean, obviously, the hypocrisy of that moment. But instead but also the FBI promoted this sort of very conservative idea about sexuality, and of course, as your film points out, the threat of African Americans to the prevailing white view of sexuality, and all of that is tied in, and we lose sight of what the 50s were like, where sexual hypocrisies were at their height. At least the 60s began to burst the bubble a little bit. But anyway, I think that, and of course I assume that part of the concern about the 2027 release of more information is that it will be more detailed and more salacious.
Well, that's the issue. Will it be? And some people feel like it shouldn't be released, and some people feel it should be released. I'm of the opinion, release it and let people decide. Let people have their own opinions about it. And but the only thing I would say in releasing the information, the material from 2027. Don't release it, don't parcel it out, release all of it. Don't edit it. Parcel, just release all of it. That's my take.
So in terms of the structure of the film, in terms of what I describe as this kind of propulsive energy, is that something that you conceived of early on? I mean, did you have this notion of just bang, 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 using the Hollywood clips and sort of building this head of steam? Because it really does. It's a driving force.
I would love to say to you, Jay, that it was all worked out in my head. I sat down there and we just did it like that. But the reality is no.
Okay.
The first cut of this film was 2.5 hours. 2.5 hours. We had everything in the kitchen sink. And when you're sitting, and you know this well, when you're sitting in the editing room or you're looking at your cuts, you always have that first feeling in your gut that says, oh my God, this is a mess. This is never going to come together. But, I've been around the block a few times, so I always sort of take a deep breath and say to myself, okay, now we've got the framework. Now we got to figure out how to shape it, hold it down, give it pace, give it some more structure, and make it coherent so an audience will stay engaged. So, we had to go through, we dropped out major scenes, we did some restructuring and moving things around. The only two things that we did at the beginning that I knew that I wanted to keep was the opening when A. Philip Randolph introduces Dr. King at the March on Washington, the moral leader of the Civil Rights Movement. I knew we wanted to keep that. And when we were looking at the archival footage, I knew when I saw that piece with Ronald Reagan, I said, we got to keep that. That's movies,
Yes, absolutely,
So everything else was like, we had so much information, so much material about these two brothers who had been communists, and then they left the Communist Party and they came back, and they became, they began working for the FBI. They were good friends with Stanley Levinson, who was introduced to King, so there was this whole connection that they got Levinson to meet King. We had so much material, we just had to really hone it down.
Right.
It's always a little bit, it's always a tussle.
And Stanley Levinson, as I understand it, he was a car dealer and a businessman, a member of the American Jewish Congress, which was considered a left-leaning organization.
Yeah.
He supported the defense of the Rosenbergs in the early 50s, and that sort of tainted him.
That's right.
But the FBI has no real proof that he was ever a member of the Communist Party.
No, not at all.
So there were these allegations, and if you traveled in certain circles, that was enough for a lot of these guys. And that there was no suggestion, even after 1957, that he even was associated with some of the people that they were, tried to tag him on. But in any case, nonetheless, they pushed it. And it's what they got JFK and Bobby Kennedy to sort of to buy into it.
Because the other thing to remember too is that even within King's organization, by the late 50s, early 60s, the FBI had been really looking very closely at Bob Rustin,
right,
who had socialist and leftist leanings.
Right. And
they had wanted King, they had suggested that King disconnect himself from Bob Rustin.
Right.
So, the scene that I always find fascinating too is when King is invited to the White House by Bobby and John Kennedy and is told to break off his relationship with Stanley Levinson.
Yeah.
And he basically lies to these two guys. He says, I will, but he never does. Because Stanley became very close, Clarence Shells said so eloquently, Stanley was a very close confidant of Dr. King.
Right.
Very close.
And contributed to some of the speeches as well.
Exactly.
Now it's interesting that going back to the white peace movement again for a second, you also have members of the white peace movement, including Dave Dellinger, who was one of the leaders of the Chicago 7, who criticized King for his associations with JFK and Bobby Kennedy. So you also had a movement force that was critical of King for playing a White House strategy, when clearly, in the final analysis, it was crucially important that Johnson signing that civil rights legislation and his lobbying for it was extremely important.
Well, that's one of the things about Johnson, who also, as we know, very complicated. For me, that's made him a very interesting president. I mean, the Great Society is very interesting, even though, as we could see with Vietnam, he botched that up completely.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. Well, anyway, I want to see if there's some questions from the audience. I also want to recommend the other works of Sam's that we are not, we showed Mr. Soul in the spring.
Oh, you did?
Which is fabulous. And did anybody see it, Mr. Soul, the documentary we showed? It's about a TV show that was played on public television, PBS, from like 1969 to 73, that was fabulous. And it was a variety show, it was entertainment, but it also had a social consciousness about it. It came across to me as a show of African American music, theater, dance, politics, as African Americans wanted to do it. And largely for an African American audience, although certainly there was a white audience as well. But it was a fabulous show, and it was terminated finally because of political pressure, as I remember.
That's correct. That's correct. It was a show on WNET public television, and I used to see it every week. Every week.
It was fabulous. Anyway, we'll talk more. We're going to talk again this evening after Four Little Girls about sort of his work and how he's come around to it. But let's see if there are any questions here. I'm also happy to do some more talking. Yes. Yes, sir.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the excellent movie. Just a question: did your research shed any light on who was behind the murder of Martin Luther King, and also by extension the two Kennedys?
Well, no, we know that you heard the question I asked Anthony Young. Did he feel that James Earl Ray was the one? And he said no, but he didn't want to go into it. We didn't research it because it wasn't really a part of the film. I mean, that's a whole different film to me. So we stayed away from that, really.
James Earl Ray, as you may know, sought a retrial for the last part of his life, and he was supported by the King family in that effort. And there was also a civil case that indicated that James Earl Ray did not act alone. And I believe that there are literally tens of thousands of pages of material that you can find, I believe, on the King Center website.
You can.
You can?
You can find.
Yeah. So if you're interested in that subject, there's a great volume of material on the King Center website about King assassination and, concerns and ambiguities around it.
On the other hand, there's a book called Hellhound on His Trail by Hampton Sides, which documents James Earl Ray's actions before and after.
Yeah, I'm aware of that book.
Yeah, so it's worth having a look at that too. Thank you so much for being here and sharing this film. The last page of Bearing the Cross, David Garrow quotes one of Dr. King's daughters, Diane Nash, and said it's time to tell the full story. And this is just when some of the evidence is coming out about Dr. King's private life. And it would seem to be consistent with telling the full story when those tapes come out. They point out that the danger of not doing so is, of course, something we're all familiar with, making him a mythological figure. And my worry is that, as so many people do, is that that's happened. Every time the MLK Day comes along, folks talk about that. We turn him into a certain myth. So I wonder about almost the potential film or some other work of art that tells the story of how we talk about Dr. King. So for example, young people think that folks thought he was a hero right up until he died, but as your work shows and polls show, that was not the case. So I just wonder, from your artistic expression and the work you've done, how you think about that, the stories you tell about Dr. King and what it tells about us.
Well, I think it'd be interesting to do a film about how we do that with a lot of icons, how we turn them into mythological heroes. I mean, you might have been on something that's another possible film for me. You know, because think about it this way. I mean, now King is looked at with such reverence by the right. You know, when they say King wouldn't have approved of Black Lives Matter, you know, because he wasn't that way. They don't really know who he was. It's sort of the same thing that when you see how people react to Muhammad Ali now, people forget that in 1965, 66, he was a pariah in America. You know, how dare this guy decide he wanted to fight in Vietnam? So you got an interesting point here. This might be another film for me, man. Thank you. What's your name?
John, you should have said anything.
I'm going to have to credit you, man.
You got it.
Good idea. Okay, we have one more question people have on, and otherwise, does anybody have anything else?
Well, thank you again for being here.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it. The music was phenomenal. Was that your choice? I have a loud voice.
I can go.
The music.
It was a young jazz musician named Gerald Clayton, based out of California. His father's a bass player, and he's from a family of jazz musicians. And he had never done a movie score. And we had hired him to do the music for the sizzle reel. And Ben and I said to ourselves, you think we should take a chance on this guy for the score? And this was an interesting kind of dynamic, because on documentaries, a lot of times when you're editing the films, the editors who you work with, they're like, you know, we create a temp score, you know, temporary music. And the editor we had, Laura Tomasello, who I think did a fabulous job. She had went to a library. She had found all this wonderful temp music that she had built out. She loved it. And when we said to her, we're going to have Gerald Clayton do a score, and he did some first early, you know, themes, she hated it. She said, this is terrible, it's destroying what I did with the temp score, we can't use this. And so Ben and I said, whoa, whoa, whoa. Because I'm an editor myself, and I know how you can get wedded to temp scores. And I said, Laura, we gotta try. We gotta give him some more direction, we gotta get, you know, so I would talk to talk to Gerald about themes, about instrumentation. And then he would create some more stuff, and finally, she was able to understand how it could be effectively used. And so a lot of this music that he created, she also helped shape it, because I had said to them, give her this term that we use called the musical stems. So not just, you know, the main stuff, but the extra stuff, the extra bass stuff, the extra drum stuff, the extra horn stuff. So she could sometimes reshape it. So, you know, the thing about making films, all kinds of films, fiction films, documentary films, is that if you find the right collaborators and you all can sort of be in sync, even when you tussle, you can make something that can be very powerful.
Great. Sam, thank you so much. We'll be back this evening.